the Psychologist. So quickly about Dr. Emily King. She's a child psychologist.
Did Karen freeze? Okay. We'll give it a second and then I'll just introduce myself, which will be fun.
Maybe go ahead, Emily.
Okay. Yeah,
If you
no
feel
problem.
comfortable introducing yourself, go for it.
No
Yeah.
problem. I think she just hopped off and she'll hop back on. So yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I have a slide for this too. So hey y'all, thank you so much for having me. We are going to do about 15 minutes of questions. I get lots of questions when I talk about this topic. So I'm going to aim for about 45 minutes of teaching, and then we'll have about 15 for questions. So we are going to kind of skim the surface today because there's a lot of things I can talk about that I could go deeper on. I'm going to try to stick with school age kids, but absolutely throw in things for our teens and even young adults who still have executive functioning weaknesses when we think about neurodivergence. So a little bit about me first. So I am a child psychologist, licensed psychologist in North Carolina. I was a school psychologist for the first 5 years of my career. My doctorate is actually in school psychology. And so my heart is in education. And then when I actually did my school psych internship, postdoc, and early training in Houston, Texas, and then returned home to Raleigh about 15 years ago. And I've been in private practice since then simply because I love collaboration so much and I didn't want to feel as married to just testing at that point. And so my experience over the years has really been with kids, teens, parents, and teachers and all their, collaborating providers. So I come at this from a very holistic standpoint that's not just all about school or all about mental health, but really about all the different areas that these kids show up in their daily lives. I'm also the parent to two neurodivergent boys, so I know autism and ADHD and all kinds of side affiliated issues, as I like to call them, and strengths very well. And that has been a parallel journey that has just enriched my work a lot over the years. So my boys are currently in 6th grade and 12th grade in Wake County Public Schools. I am working on my first book, which I'm really excited about, called The Neurodivergent Learner, which will be out next year. So if you want to learn more about me, there's a slide at the end that'll take you to additional things that I do for parents. So today we're going to focus on what is neurodiversity, what is neurodivergence, what's the difference? Isn't this what we've all been doing the whole time? We're just calling it this now. Yes, that's exactly what's happening. But neurodiversity is just that we are all neurodiverse from one another, and then some of us are neurodivergent. And the diagnoses that usually includes are autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, giftedness, or twice-exceptionality, so intellectual giftedness along with some sort of identified disability. Some people include anxiety, mood disorders under that umbrella as well. My expertise is more in learning and behavior, so that's where I stay focused when I talk about neurodivergence. At the end of the day, what it all shakes out to is asynchronous development. So kids that present with a strength in one area, a weakness in another area, and that can be very confusing to them, to their parents, to their teachers. And so when we are thinking about a child's skills, that's how we have to figure out all the little parts of their skills to be able to support them. So a quick word about diagnostic labels before we go into talking lots today about different presentations and strategies. As you all know, no two kids with the same diagnostic label are going to be the same. That is the first thing we might hear about a kid, but should never be the last thing. We should never make assumptions about, oh, well, they're autistic or they have ADHD, therefore X, Y, and Z. We should ask, how does that show up for them? What is that like for you? Does that give you any strengths? Does that mean that you need extra support? We start asking questions, is what I like to say, when someone discloses to us that they have neurodivergence of some kind. What labels do for kids is that it helps them gain support to services, and that's why evaluations are important. And then as they grow and develop into the teen years, it helps give them an understanding of their identity and how they fit in with their neurotype of, okay, so I'm not less than. This isn't hard because I'm not trying hard enough. This is just hard for me because it's mismatched with how school is set up or mismatched with how everyone else around me is doing it. And that's okay. So I'm glad we're recording because I always get questions about this slide and like, can I screenshot this slide? But this is a really important slide that is really the foundation of everything I teach. And this is out of work from occupational therapists when we're thinking about learning from the bottom up, learning from the body up to the brain versus the top down, the brain down. And I think a lot of traditional schooling, a lot of parenting is we're just kind of talking at kids and telling them what to do or what to understand. But if you see that academic learning or the behavior or the daily living activities, which is all the stuff that parents and teachers teach kids, it's really the last thing that comes when all the other foundational stuff is aligned. So thinking about the sensory system, thinking about the felt safety of a child, the development of their motor skills, their language skills, how they move and navigate their communication skills, and how all of that is the foundation for then they're able to learn. So whenever we have significant behavior, which we'll go through some examples of how to figure those things out, usually it's something underneath the top part of this little triangle. And some people think about this like the iceberg of we only see the tip of the iceberg, or, you know, what is going on underneath that is making it hard for this child to learn. And when it comes to neurodivergence, there can be lots of things. But what it all boils down to is, how do kids first feel safe? So I feel safe in my body, I feel safe in this place, and I feel safe with these people. Those are the things we're trying to help them with in identifying and in figuring out how to solve that if they don't feel safe. So some ways we can do that is making things very familiar to them, you know, as friendly as we can, whether that is new people they're meeting. And as parents, we don't do a great job of this when we're interacting with our kids at the end of the day and everyone's fried. But having routine connections that are familiar and friendly can help kids start to trust the relationships and the predictability of what's going to happen around them. Feeling seen and valid and understood by the adults around them, and then they believing that their teachers and parents are going to keep showing up even when it's hard. And these are some of the things that I hear that make school a little bit more predictable than home life. You know, I work with lots of families who things will be going well at school and then they're not going well at home. And sometimes that's just because school is very structured and predictable. Sometimes the reverse is true. Things are very hard at school and things are great at home. And that might mean that that child needs more room to breathe, a slower pace, lower demands, and the school day might be going too fast for them. So if there's a discrepancy between home life and school life, we want to get to the bottom of why and not just think, oh, it's a certain person that's doing something wrong. It's likely something systemic that's misaligned between their neurotype and what's being expected of them. So how I like to think about this is, and this is a slide I use with kids, so I like to use it with adults too, because we can all learn about our autonomic nervous system. And so we all have our autonomic nervous system, which is, when we go into a stress response, it's called the sympathetic part of our nervous system. And then we're going to recover and go into a relaxation response. This cycle that we go through happens more often with neurodivergent kids because they're closer to being sensitive to something, sending them outside of what I call their window of tolerance. So they may have physiological symptoms of being stressed, and then once they expend all that energy, then they can rest and recover. But an example of what this might look like is an autistic child having to do a fire drill at school. We know that, having an upset reaction to that is not an active choice. That is absolutely a sensory input that's overwhelming their nervous system. And so we support that to help dampen the noise, to make sure they're with a safe person, to make sure they understand what's going on. And they still may have those physiological symptoms, but once they get outside and they realize it's just a fire drill, I'm safe, then their body might start coming back online. Like their breathing's going to come back, their pupils will shrink down. These are all things that their nervous system is recovering after that threat. Well, if you think about going through multiple of these cycles throughout the day, or if you have, you're pushed outside of that window of tolerance more often, that's exhausting. And many neurodivergent kids struggle with being tired, needing rest, and it's just something for us to keep in mind that their bodies are working much harder. So I always love to show this slide to parents, but especially to teachers, because I think that sometimes when we think about the vagus nerve and when we're going through those autonomic nervous system responses, we forget that this vagus nerve, you can see it kind of wraps around our heart and wraps around our stomach and in our intestines. So when kids have stomach aches, when kids have tightness in their chest, often those things are starting from an authentic somatic place. They do gain patterns over time, like, oh, well, I communicated that I have stomach ache, and now I'm out of class, and now I feel better. And so they may not be able to really connect it, but those are often real things that are happening. So that's why that we see more anxiety in these populations, because they truly are having more often reactions to the emotional overwhelm. Another way to think about this is the window of tolerance. This is an excellent slide from Dr. Megan Anna Neff. She's an autistic psychologist that I highly recommend you follow. She just has an amazing way of explaining lots of these things. But when we think about our window of tolerance, this is where we learn. This is where we can listen, where we can receive information, where we're engaged and curious. And then when we're pushed outside of our window of tolerance, either in hyperarousal or hypoarousal, this is where we can't learn and we're overwhelmed. We need to recover or we need support. And so when we think about when we're trying to communicate with our kids when they're upset, those words aren't going to get in because they're outside of that window. So think about your child's emotional state plus what you're trying to communicate to them, and the timing of them being available to learn or to listen to you is really important. And then one thing to know is that many neurodivergent individuals, kids, adults, their window of tolerance is just smaller than neurotypical folks. So every person is going to have a different size window of tolerance, and our window of tolerance is going to ebb and flow throughout our life, through our experiences, for all kinds of reasons. But generally speaking, many neurodivergent kids, whether it is due to sensory sensitivities or just autism in general, most autistic children have a sensitive nervous system. ADHD, quick to respond, quick to, the behaviors come out before emotions get processed, that kind of feeling. So the window of tolerance can look much smaller for them. So how do we help our kids expand that window of tolerance, right? So one way to do it is to start by thinking about sensory demand. So how is this space or maybe these people, how is this overwhelming to a child's sensory system, and how can we lower that? How can we slow things down, like slow the pacing, or add time so the expectation is the same, but the time is different? Increasing safe connections with others. And I hear from teachers all the time, I know I have to have safe connections, I know. And many of them do. But then what's added with neurodivergent students is the skills. So we're going to talk about some executive functioning strategies to help support these kids as well. Thinking about how can you make the environment predictable if things are really chaotic around that time that your child is upset, or if you think there's not a lot of structure around them. Usually when things feel chaotic, we need more structure, and then that will help things feel more predictable. I don't believe it's by accident that lots of autistic individuals love routine and love rituals. It's very soothing for all of us. And so they lean into that a little bit more because it's incredibly regulating. And then speaking of regulating, something else that's really regulating is incorporating our interests. So we find joy and connection and engagement in our interests. Many kids with ADHD, especially the gifted ADHD group, can hyper focus on an interest and just really it seems like they can do so much more in that setting than maybe out something that's outside of their window of tolerance. They struggle to stay regulated if they're doing something that's boring. So I'm going to use a few examples with autism and ADHD today, just in the interest of time, but I certainly cover more about twice-exceptionality and the other work that I do. So we know from autism that many kids will have more rote skills than abstract skills, and that can be really hard for them in school. So like early reading, early math skills, like hyperlexia as early readers, kids who teach themselves to read, they may not understand what they're reading, but they can read loads of words. Or kids that are excellent at math facts, and then by the time it gets to fourth grade, where there's fractions and shapes and things get more abstract, they start to struggle around that time in the curriculum. And so thinking about if they're rote learners, how can we support their understanding of some of these more abstract concepts? And if we have a rote learner, like a literal thinker, a concrete thinker, all the same thing, we want to think about how that child also might be looking at things socially. This is why social skills can be hard to generalize. So reading with kids and making predictions about what is going to happen with characters is often one way to practice social skills for kids who are literal thinkers. And writing is often the hardest for many reasons, for ADHD and for autism, but there's the most executive functioning goes into it with that many, how many steps it takes to write. But then there's the fine motor component and the planning of the literacy component of what you're going to say. So I see it as one of the biggest anxiety producers and one of the tasks in school that needs the most scaffolding and teasing apart and, you know, sectioning off different parts of the writing process. This is one of my favorite slides to show. I don't know who this student is, but I saw this online and I thought, I wonder if this student is a literal concrete thinker. So this teacher said, of course, name each of the following shapes. One of the first thing I noticed about this was look at that kid's handwriting. It's excellent, right? So I show this to teachers often to remind them that you may have one intention for a direction, but a student may interpret it in a different way. And you can use that as a jumping off point by saying, like, tell me about Lulu. What's going on with this shape? And maybe there's a story behind it and you could take it in a different direction instead of telling a child that they're doing it, quote unquote, wrong just because they did it differently than how it was described to them. So sometimes how learning can feel to the autistic child is it's too loud in here, so I can't focus. So the sensory is overwhelming to the child, so attention and engagement are hard. I can't focus on this unless I'm interested in it. I hear this a lot from kids. I'm not choosing to not do it. I just can't focus on this topic. You know, I've had especially teens tell me, like, I don't even know anything about this topic. They can't even attempt to make something up because it's just not their topic. Or I'm not motivated to work on this because I don't see how it is important to my life and my interest. And this is super common for all teenagers to say, but definitely for kids who feel they may be very self-directed in their interest, or they may feel like they can't see the forest for the trees kind of feeling of we need to meet them where they are and try to teach along the path of what they're interested in if possible. So for ADHD, we of course know there are 3 types of ADHD: impulsive, hyperactive, inattentive, and then combined. And treatment includes a blend usually of medication options and environmental support. So increasing structure, and then making sure that we are using visuals so that kids don't have to rely on keeping everything in their brain. We think a lot about visuals for autism support, but it is one of the main strategies also for ADHD due to weak executive functioning. Many kids and teens with ADHD, especially the gifted ADHD profile, can hyperfocus and have some incredibly creative interests and outlets and skills. So we want to make sure we don't miss any of those. And then sleep and movement are so important for this population simply because they tend to not sleep well because their bodies often are hyper aroused. And so we have to be careful about sleep. Lots of I hear it all the time where parents will come in and say, my kid didn't sleep through the night for the first year or two. And then later on, they were diagnosed with ADHD. Lots of sleep disruption with autism as well. And then if we aren't sleeping well, if kids are not sleeping well, then they can't pay attention well. And then with hyperactivity, we want to think about matching their environment with how much they need to move. And so that's why I wanted to include this study that was done. I think we're finally putting this issue of taking away recess to bed, but I always mention it because we should never be taking recess away from kids, especially if they have ADHD, because results have shown from many studies that the inappropriate behavior was consistently higher on the days when they don't have recess compared to days that they didn't. So recess actually helps them because they're moving and regulating their bodies. And then in lots of traditional discipline approaches, that's something that's taken away. So I just add that because if there's anyone out there that is being met still with that outdated thinking, I want to validate you and reaffirm for you that that is outdated thinking, and we want kids to be able to move their bodies. If a child is not finishing something in time, that needs to be solved by giving them more time later or by shortening the task, not by making them miss movement that their body needs to then pay attention later. Another way to think about hyperactivity is verbal hyperactivity, which sometimes happens more often. We'll see this in girls. But when we think about the ADHD brain, many adults have parents really of clients of mine have said, this is me, or this is someone in my family. That all the little distraction points that might happen in your brain while you're trying to tell a story. And this slide just emphasizes the effort that's put forth, not only to regulate, but also to control impulses and to stay focused on simply telling a story. So I use this slide really to help parents and teachers understand the internal effort that's going on for kids. When we ask them just to do one thing, their brain might be doing 5 things just to be able to do that one thing. So how learning can feel to the child with ADHD, it might feel like I'm being asked to do something that's too much or too long. I understand it because many of these kids do, but I can't focus on it to get started. So just because kids aren't completing it does not mean that they don't understand it. It could mean that they don't understand it, but not necessarily. I'm spending all my energy staying in this seat, so I can't focus on the work. So these are the kids that need to stand while they work. They need to maybe move around the room. These are the older kids that need to doodle. Lots of people need to doodle in order to be able to pay attention. But when kids are not, we don't explain to them that these executive functioning weaknesses are different than intelligence, they can often start to feel like they're not smart. They'll say, am I not smart? I can't show the teacher what I know. I can't complete this thing. And in traditional schooling, that's how we measure success. And so we have to start helping them understand, if they start second guessing their intelligence, that a lot of school has to do with this slide, executive functioning skills. And so I love using this slide because it's completely overwhelming, right? And so if you think about all the planning, the organization, the getting started, managing your time, holding information in your brain, which is our working memory, paying attention, thinking about our thinking, controlling our impulses, pivoting when something doesn't work, sticking with it. All of that is our executive functioning. And of course, as most of you know, our brains don't fully develop until we're 25. So when we're talking about teens and college age students, they're still struggling with this too. And then if they have ADHD, or many autistic individuals have executive functioning weaknesses too, they still need support on these things and may need support their whole life, and that's okay. We don't need to wait to add support. We can just go ahead and help kids do it. If we're seeing avoidance with a child with ADHD, many of them are smart and that they will figure out. I look better if I just, don't do the work. And then they either rush through it or they look like they're working or they avoid it. So I'll use this to show kids of like, of course you look great if you haven't done any of it, but that's where we have to put in the effort and it's going to be messy and that's okay. All right, so some strategies to get you started if this is something that you are trying to support a child with. We want to make sure that we're helping kids plan visually. And I could go down a rabbit hole right now about how we have paper that we've got kids on at school, we've got digital that we've got kids on at school, we've got family calendars and devices, like it's a whole thing, right? So maybe we can talk about it more at Q&A, but there are many strategies and systems that families and classrooms and students have figured out that work best, but visual is the way to go, so that a child doesn't have to hold that in their mind. They can think, oh, I forgot what I'm going to do. I can just go and check the calendar, or check my agenda, or check this. Of course, it has to be on there to be able to check it. So that's something that we'll talk about in a minute when we talk about scaffolding support for our kids. For organizing, this is something that parents, hate that they still have to do, but you still have to do it. So regularly cleaning out, especially middle school backpacks, folders. If your kid comes home with papers everywhere, they're not independent yet with their organization, and that's okay. But if the papers are cascading out of the backpack and they're all crunched in the bottom, we need a better system. Helping kids understand that getting started is not step one. That's actually step two. Step one is being ready. And what does ready look like? It might look, you might take a picture of, it looks like all your materials are out. It might be that there's a post-it note with a list on it. This is what ready looks like. It might be that there's a picture of a child next to the door with a backpack and a lunchbox and a water bottle, and that's what ready looks like. So executive functioning weaknesses will often make kids have a hard time visualizing what we mean when we say ready or get started. Helping kids with focus. Now, sometimes this is where medication comes in, but also the more engaging it is, the more interesting it is, the more aligned it is with how a kid thinks, not only on their interests, but with the speed of their brain. I've had kids be bored out of their mind because things are going too slowly, and kids that are completely lost because things are going too quickly. So when a child is struggling with focus, think about the speed with which something is happening and also the content of it, because something's misaligned with how they learn. And then over time, this is a long-term goal of helping them self-monitor. So we want to start with what they can do independently and give them strategies to keep doing those things versus just waiting for them to get independent, if that makes sense. And so the other thing to think about with learning is that it's an emotional journey too, because we've got to think about frustration and frustration tolerance and the emotional stamina it takes to keep coming back for more. So thinking beyond school, like whether it's a musical instrument or a sport or learning how to build something or learning coding or whatever the thing is that your kid is into, we want to make sure, first of all, that there's interest there, because we always start with the unknown when we're learning. And we have to have the skill to be able to do it, but we also have to have the interest. There are plenty of things that kids are good at, but if they don't care about it, they're not going to stick with it. They're not going to have the motivation. And then they have to have, of course, the planning, the executive functioning to do it, and the emotional stamina to keep going, because every time they make a mistake, they might, drop out of that window of tolerance and then have to re-regulate themselves, and it's got to be worth it to keep going, right? So in order for this for learning to work, this is how I think about it. We've got a child's skill level at one spot, and then you could call it expectation of like, we're going to play guitar for this long, or we're going to work on these things today, or it could be some sort of level, like we're going to, or some sort of distance, like we're going to bike this far on a bike, whatever the expectation is. If we've got just enough anxiety to push beyond the skill level to grow, basically, that is what we're aiming for. It's for this little anxiety bubble or cloud to be tolerable, for it to be fairly small, if that makes sense. And then thinking through what happens when it's not. So this next slide, let me grab this. What happens when it's not is when the expectation and the skill level are so discrepant that a child is definitely going to be pushed outside of their window of tolerance, and they can be flooded with just emotional overwhelm. It's all the same thing. We call it lots of different stuff, but they could be completely overwhelmed and shut down. They can be so upset that they can't talk to you. This is when we get like refusal and avoidance, maybe arguing. This is where we see all of those behaviors that happen. So we're working to either scaffold the skill or adjust the expectation temporarily, whether that's to slow it down or to make it smaller so that it feels more doable for the child. And this is, of course, true for all of us with learning. It's just much more of a delicate process for kids with asynchronous development or our neurodivergent kids. So I'm going to take you through some problem solving slides to think about kids in your life that you're either working with or that your own kids. So we got to first figure out what's the trigger. We do this as therapists. We think about this as school psychologists, especially if we're helping consult with a teacher, what's going on in terms of just what's the pattern, right? Is it avoidance? Is it always happening with a transition? Is it always happening when a parent says no? That's a very common one. Is it something that just feels too hard? Is it always social? These are just some examples because it could be anything. And then are there patterns? Is it time of day? Is it anything related to halt, hungry, angry, lonely, tired? Is it a certain person, a certain task, a certain limit? You probably have a gut feeling, or a parent that you're working with or that you have a gut feeling, but figuring out that pattern is how we have to get to the bottom of that triangle. We've got to figure out what is the skill or the emotional regulation weakness in there that we need to support. Okay, so let's say we found the trigger. We then have to decide, is it something you need to work on right now? And this is where we get caught up in chronological age. Like, my kid is 12. They should be able to do whatever. Okay, so try not to do that if you're raising or coaching or parenting or teaching a neurodivergent kid, because they may not have that skill even if they're 12, or they may have a skill that a 14-year-old has, and you don't want to support that skill too long. You want them to be independent. So if it's something, and I'm going to get to this on the next slide, but if it's something that is really not something that they're ready to learn, it's okay to let that go. And sometimes when we just reduce demands on that thing, the trigger goes away and we decide we're going to work on that in a year. We're going to work on that later. But if it's something that we do need to work on, can we eliminate some sort of stressor? Can we reduce the demand? How can we increase the support around this child? And then how can we increase connection? Because sometimes we need the support, the skills, and the connection to help them feel safe while they learn the hard thing. So here's how I think about the different skill levels and making that decision of, are we going to work? Is this something we're going to work on right now? So as a parent, or when you're talking with families, of if that's a developmental skill that child is not doing yet. And these are things like we would do it for them. We would pour their milk for them if their motor skills weren't developed. So these are all things that they are not yet developmentally ready to do. And then I'm going to skip to the last point. Then we've got mastered. This is the other this is clear, right? These are skills they can do consistently regardless of what kind of mood they're in or if they're tired. So let's say they're an older school age kid, they can get dressed even if they're feeling sick, for instance. And then everything else is in the middle, and this is what's the trickiest part. So these are all emerging skills that we usually are doing it with our kids. And especially with neurodivergent kids, it is a moving target and it ebbs and flows. Like, they could do it yesterday, and why can't they do it today? Well, it might be because they're tired, or they're hungry, or they're constipated, or they're upset about something. And so the best thing to do in these situations is just to support their bodily needs and whatever they need, and then look for a pattern. So is it when they're rested, fed, and in a good mood, they can do this thing? That means it's emerging. It might mean that we need to do it with them or even for them on a day where they're sick, but we can let them know, I'm going to help you today because you're not feeling well, but this is something you can do on your own when you're feeling better. So we don't get into that trap of enabling. So examples of reducing demands, and this goes for kids, but also for families, because I think we, in many ways, we want the best for our kids, but sometimes we confuse the best with the most. And we have to remember that sometimes the best is doing less. So canceling activities, prioritizing sleep and play, especially together, slowing the pace, working together on routine things at home, and incorporating interest into activities that are boring. So like chores, incorporating music into chores, gamifying things like that. And then increasing supports. This is all to shrink that anxiety cloud that was in the previous visual. How can we make things visual so that they don't have to rely on executive functioning? And we don't either. The more automated it is, the better. How can we make it routine? And that's something that many autistic children who have excellent memories, they can memorize a schedule, no problem. And then actually something that will come up later is if the plan changes and they haven't memorized, then that's a problem we have to solve in the other direction. Adding structure, and you're going to hear me say many times, including interest, but adding regulation with movement, music, and also nature is something that we are wired to feel better when we do those things. And music, movement, nature, those are all things that are going to help us. And also usually adding, the old saying, like when a baby's upset, just add water. There's something to that in terms of the bottom of that pyramid, that triangle of helping regulate a child's nervous system before we can expect them to learn. Before we go into questions, I did want to do a few slides on how executive functioning can make motivation harder, because this is something that especially bright kids with ADHD can really struggle with, because they have, I'll hear this from teachers all the time. They have so much potential. Why aren't they doing what they need to be doing? And because of short attention spans and difficulty with delayed gratification, like this thing now is going to lead to this thing later, tasks right in front of them can feel really irrelevant to long-term goals. And so one strategy that I've developed over the years and used with kids, I call the backwards timeline. So an example of this would be a child not getting started on homework or a worksheet. However, they are very motivated to live on their own one day. And so it's taking a very far off goal, also making it visual, because if this is just explained verbally, then it's out, it's out into the ether the second they walk away from you. So mapping this out and starting on the right side of the page, and I often will do this on a whiteboard with kids of like, okay, you want to live on your own one day. What do you have to do to live on your own? You have to have money. Okay, how are you going to get money? I have to get a job. Okay, how are you going to get a job? I have to graduate from high school. How are you going to graduate from high school? I've got to actually finish these courses and get good grades. Okay, how are you going to finish your courses? I've got to do my work. Okay, how are you going to do your work? I got to do this worksheet right now. So somehow making that long-term goal that they do care about, and it can be, I want to be an NFL player. It can be anything. It doesn't have to be something that they're actually going to do later on. You're connecting their motivation and their engagement and the relationship you have with them to help them see and start to build the threads through daily practices that can often get them to things they want to do. And I also wanted to share that, especially for kids with short attention spans, external rewards get a bad rap in terms of like, I don't like, necessarily love sticker charts or definitely don't love clip charts, things like that teachers use in young classrooms, just because they're so public and they can often become very rote, and kids are working for things and not working for internal motivation. But external rewards sometimes are necessary to jumpstart a routine with a kid with a short attention span. And so encouraging a new experience, helping a child identify what feels rewarding them to about it. Maybe it's like we're gonna go out for ice cream, you know, after we go to this thing 3 times, or they may not have the attention span for it to be at the end of the week and it needs to be a much shorter reward for that. The attention span has to match the timing of when something is going to be rewarding. But then as soon as the experience or the task or whatever it is starts to become intrinsically motivating, like they feel proud of themselves, they're satisfied with, what's going on, then, or a routine sets in, then we start to fade because we want that intrinsic goal of, I feel good about this, to take over. Okay, so it is time for Q&A. So y'all drop questions in the chat or raise your hands. And we can go deeper of anything I talked about. I know that it was quick and it was kind of a skim of the information, but I want to be able to answer specific questions. So let me know, Karen, if you want me to unshare so we can see everyone.
Yeah, you can do that.
Okay.
Absolutely. Someone has just asked in the chat, will the slides be available online too?
I can do that if y'all would like me to. So I can send Karen a PDF. Yeah, there's some really great visuals in there and some citations if you want to look further at some of the things I mentioned. Yeah, I will send a PDF of those. It might work best if I'll probably drop it in a Google Drive link.
That's
That
fine.
might work
Yeah,
best.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And we'll be happy to share that with you guys as well. And we can definitely attach it when it's online. We'll show it where you can access it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear who do we, I mean, I don't know if we can take a poll, but do we have mostly professionals, mostly parents, mostly teachers? Um,
Yeah, absolutely. If you guys want, you could type it in the chat.
yeah, sure. One question is, how often do I do workshops? So I do online parent workshops the first Friday of every month. My next one is next Friday, October 3rd. That one's going to be all about school and helping parents with navigating school. So yeah, so I didn't talk a whole lot about that in this talk, but parent-teacher collaboration is something that I do full workshops on, because what can be so hard is that discrepancy I was talking about between what a child can look like at school versus home, and also in our offices, right? So we might be getting really inconsistent information from what we see versus what a parent sees versus what a teacher sees. I actually use all of that as data, because something is, I mean, some days I just feel like a detective, right? Like something is going on, and also I like to think about what is working, because I think most of us were not really trained on thinking about what is working. We're thinking about problem identification and fixing. And if something is working, we need to figure out how to do that in multiple settings.
Okay. Questions.
Yeah.
How do you handle low processing speed with
Mm.
ADHD?
Yes. So slow processing is, not unique to ADHD, but it definitely can co-occur. And so we definitely want to support that with visuals, because what can happen is a child's, and again, sometimes slow processing is more working memory weaknesses than actually, so it can be both. But when we have visuals, we can coach a child to know when you lose track or when you feel like someone's moved on without you, because often what will happen with slow processing is the class has moved on or the family has moved on and the child is still, lagging behind. When they feel like, oh, I'm behind, teaching them independence with, figuring out what their next step is, whether that is through, a checklist, a visual checklist, or if that is with homework of, slowing our own pace. That's something that is so hard as a parent, is slowing our own pace of listening to wait for a child with processing speed weaknesses to get that out. Thank y'all for putting all of your stuff But here, I'll
Okay, let me try this again. What do
Yeah.
you do when one parent sees the behavior as a lack of discipline and believes they can control the behavior, even though the child shuts down with discipline and it doesn't work?
Right.
Also, the child behaves for one parent out of fear and not the other.
So I don't know if this is a parent or a professional, because my answer depends. So if this is your partner, your parenting partner, this is tricky, right? So you would want to work with a professional to help you get on the same page. But I'll just take this as you're the professional helping two parents with.
And she says this is a parent.
You're a parent. Okay. Yes. So this is tricky because so tricky meaning you may want to work with a professional to be a third party to help you see some of these things from your child's perspective. Because as parents, and I'll say this personally, even though with the knowledge that I have, I still am going to be biased towards what feels good to me in my nervous system or what I avoid in my nervous system. So having that third party can be really helpful to explain it from the child's perspective, but you can try. So, and some examples would be that you're noticing that your child, if a child is shutting down or going out of that window of tolerance, they're not able to hear you, they're not able to learn, they're not able to do anything more positive in that moment. One way to think this through is to just observe, start to notice patterns of when I do it this way, I make progress or I'm able to support the child better. And when we do it this way, it seems to not work. And so it can be tricky when you're, co-parenting or in a relationship with two parents who are coming at it from different perspectives. But what it boils down to at the end of the day is what's working, not who's right or wrong, what is working for that child. So this seems to be working. This doesn't seem to be working. So let's do more of what's working.
Any suggestions for a child with both ADHD and autism? We do lots of visuals, but he's struggling with tasks.
So independent skills maybe. So this is thinking through what are the skill weaknesses underneath. So we've got, if the ADHD is going to indicate the executive functioning weaknesses of maybe attention span, impulse control, or executing the tasks. But then there are a lot of related weaknesses with autism, like motor skills, communication, social motivation. And so this is one of those things that's real specific and we could go deeper on, but think about the skill weaknesses that might need to be supported that would be different from ADHD that could possibly be interfering with daily tasks. Like motor, communication, and sensory for sure. And that would be a great question for an occupational therapist if that child has an occupational therapist in their life. Mm-hmm.
Can we subscribe to your Substack through learnwithdremily.com?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
You can go here. I'll put, you can go straight to the Substack. Or this, I'll put the Substack link in the chat, but then my website is just learnwithdremily.com because I have information for schools and for parents there. But on Substack, I write blogs and do the workshops that are hosted there.
Perfect.
Oh, here's a question about a 17-year-old and motivation. Yes. So thank you for saying this because we all know that teenagers are hard, right? And then we add to it neurodivergence, and it is a really, really hard season of life. So I just want to say that and put that out there. It is just a really challenging season of parenting. Because it's that season where we really truly know our kids the best, but often, and I'm speaking generally because I don't know your child, but often they're not listening to us like all teenagers don't listen to their parents, right? So seeking out opportunities of interest for teenagers, and then what I call like the VIPs in their life, the very important people, whether that is a tutor, a coach, art teacher, like whoever it is, and then coordinating behind the scenes with that person to help increase safety and connection and motivation through a relationship that's not us, because they often are not, wanting to learn and listen to us when they're teenagers. That said, some still do because they're developmentally a little younger socially. Um, it just depends on the kid. But yes, that's the age group that I made up the backwards timeline for because so many of them were blinded kind of by what's going on right here. I can only really think about what's here right now, and I don't like it. So of course I'm not going to do it. But then it wasn't getting them to any of the goals that they really wanted to try.
Okay.
Yeah.
My child behaves well at home, but at school there are constant behavioral problems. We've tried CBT and we have an IEP, but cannot seem to get this under control. Number of emails come home from the school. I do believe there's low frustration tolerance when schoolwork is tough.
Mhm.
What next steps would you suggest for a child who is 11? Does this ever get resolved?
Yeah, so you want to find that school psychologist, whoever they are, and start problem solving what is feeling too much for this child. So the behavior is coming out of it could be sensory, it could be the pace is too fast or too slow. It could be, and sensory is not just lights and noise. It can be too many people in their space. It can be too many transitions throughout the day. An 11-year-old might be in sixth grade, might be in fifth grade. So it could be that classmates are annoying, so it could be a social and a sensory overwhelm that is so distracting that it's hard to focus. Something is too much. So it's working with the teacher, the school psychologist, sometimes the administrator, and figuring out and usually in an IEP, what needs to be tweaked is sometimes the accommodations, and then sometimes where the actual student is learning. Are there moments like, is there a pattern to it? Is it always during the ELA block? Is it always during math? Could that student work in a small group in that time that it's overwhelming? So figuring out all of those patterns to the trigger will hopefully get you to, and yes, it does get better because children mature and teams figure things out. So, yes.
How do you redirect a child with ADHD when they may be hyperactive impulsive in a setting where they need to be less active without shaming them?
hmm So, the first thing to think about is helping a child make sure that they have gotten their energy out or they're getting enough movement and sleep to regulate their body as best they can before we ask them to go into situations that the expectation is up here to sit still and their skill to sit still is down here, right? And could there be accommodations in that situation for them not to have to sit? Could they still engage in that situation by standing, depending on what it is? And so this is one of those environmental structure things of like, what can we change about the environment to make it more accessible to them? That's how we do it without shaming, is we make it okay for them to access the environment in any way that they need to without calling them out for a negative behavior. We prevent it from happening.
How to help an avoidant child, teen, young adult who shuts down and avoids interaction? How can I help him learn to feel safe in coming out and interacting so he makes progress? He has ASD, learning disorder, selective mutism, social anxiety, and trauma.
Okay. So we have with all of those things, you know, overwhelming him to go out and do things, we've got to pair that with safe people and highly preferred activities. So and that's where to start. And safe people may mean familiar people. Sometimes when I talk to families about traveling, they're blown away that their kid did things when they went on a weekend trip that they would have never done in Raleigh, that, on a Saturday afternoon. Sometimes when we get our children and teens just out of their really stuck routines, they actually can grow and try different stuff. And then we've got to support whatever the activity is with something that's they feel so confident in or so interested in that it's not a heavy lift for them. So, for instance, doing something new that's unfamiliar, they're having to navigate how they feel about the new and unfamiliar, and all of the things they feel potentially about, socially interacting with anyone. So they'll have a better chance of practicing that social interaction with interests and some people that are already familiar. And those familiar people may be family, and they probably are family at first. But the other thing that comes to mind with that to share is that many autistic children and adults are not as socially motivated as non-autistic people. And what I mean by that is doing it to please others, or doing it just because we said so, or because, they're a part of something. So oftentimes what's motivating to them is engaging with an interest, or even the satisfaction of completing a routine. I've worked with many kids that will have like a goal of going to all of the ballparks in the US, let's say, and they wanted the satisfaction of checking that off on a list gets them outside of their comfort zone, and they would have never gone on these trips otherwise. But the actual hyper focus on the interest was motivating enough to get them into these situations where they would try new things. That would be an example.
This is from a provider. Do you have any suggestions for parents who may be picking up on low-key symptoms of ASD, ADHD, and they're not sure what the next steps are? Do you have helpful screening processes? I always recommend discussing with a pediatrician and school counselor as a starting point, but are there helpful screening processes or resources that may also help them?
So I have a free workshop on this that, oh, I don't know if I can find it quickly, but maybe we can put it, it's all about evaluations. It's a free workshop it's on my Substack if y'all can go look at it. That's something you might want to share with them. For young, it depends on how old they are. For young children, you can go ahead and refer them for screening through, do we call it CDSA anymore? What do we call it in North Carolina? I can't remember. So before 3, they can be screened. And then from 3 to 5, they can be screened through the public schools. And so if it's a parent who just wants to know, I mean, schools will do like an intake screening, and they'll decide whether or not to evaluate based on the child. So yes, you can send them to their public school preschool services. If they're school age, that would go through the school psychologist. And families could also look for outside evaluations through the best resource in North Carolina is going to be the teach centers that are all over North Carolina as well. I will say with looking into autism, there seems to be what I call this no man's land of kind of like the tween age. If a child is not diagnosed by the time they're like 10 to 12, it's hard to convince a tween to get an evaluation unless they're really motivated to figure out why school is hard for them. What's the motivation in that? Oftentimes teenagers, because they want to identify, or some of them are like, I saw this thing on TikTok. I think this explains me. There's your open door to be like, okay, let's look into this. So if it's a tween or a teen that wants to know more about this, then that would be, thinking about going through school or teach or private practice. But sometimes there is this like upper elementary, middle school age, if they aren't identified yet, kids can be sensitive to something wrong with me because they're at that delicate age. So I always encourage parents just to earlier is better before puberty to try to figure out, at least get a baseline of what development is looking like. So it's okay to push for that information. Just because what's the worst that could happen? You get information and they don't get diagnosed. That would be fine. Yeah.
Okay, the questions keep pouring in, and I know it's 1 o'clock. What I can do is save the chat, guys, for you.
Sure.
And then if would you put your contact in if you're willing
Yeah.
again in the chat so people can see that? Because I have people asking questions. Are you still taking patients? All kinds of things.
Yeah, so quickly, I am not still taking patients. I am still in practice part-time, seeing the families that I have seen in the past because they keep growing and coming back for tune-ups. But no, I'm not seeing not seeing new clients anymore. But I would love to have you share information with any parents or teachers you're working with too, because I've shifted into some education work on the days I'm not in practice, and I love it, and I want to help everyone understand our kids better.
Thank you so much for this.
You're so welcome.
I will absolutely share with everybody the recording when it comes, when we get it. Just gotta do a few things on our end. We'll get it up on our website, which is www.ncpsychology.org. I'll also be happy to share a PDF of the slides
Yeah.
so that you guys will have access to those as well. And I want to thank you all for attending today. You're welcome to see any other Ask the Psychologist that we do have on our website as well. And make sure to visit Dr. Emily King's wealth of information as well. Thank you
Thank
all
y'all so
so
much.
much. Thanks.